Brenda, can you hear me?
I can. So I guess we will begin now. Correct, Shane? Okay. First of all, I want to begin by thanking all of the previous presenters. What a wonderful day that this has been. And thanks to those of you who asked the stimulating questions that you have asked. And most of all, thank you, Shane, for soldiering on with COVID. We really appreciate the effort that you have made. It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Robert Edgar. Dr. Edgar is Emeritus Professor of African Studies at Howard University and Senior Fellow in the Department of History at Stellenbosch University. He has taught as a visiting professor at the University of Virginia, Georgetown University, the National University of Lesotho, the University of Cape Town, and University of Western Cape. He specializes in the history of modern religious and political movements in Southern Africa. He has many publications, and among them are one which is germane for today is An African American in South Africa, the travel notes of Ralph J. Bunche. Welcome, Dr. Edgar.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for inviting me today. Sadly, the image of myself is not on the screen, and so I'm going to rely on Vanessa to fill in the blank with some PowerPoint slides that we're going to show today. So let's just keep it on slide number 1 for right now. One of the themes that we've been dealing with today is something that we call Black internationalism, and that is the engagement of Black people in different parts of the world, but today with African Americans and how they engaged with international issues as individuals, as members of groups, as participants in movements. And the case study that I want to focus on today is the Italian invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 and how African Americans responded to it. First of all, let's just lay out a few details about the actual invasion of Ethiopia in October 1935 by the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. Mussolini had two objectives in mind. First of all, as a kid growing up in Italy, Mussolini had felt very strongly the defeat of the Italian army at the hands of the Ethiopian army in 1896, and in particular the Battle of Adwa, in which the Ethiopians, with superior battle tactics, defeated an Italian army. And so part of what Mussolini was about as a dictator was he wanted to gain revenge for that defeat in 1896. Secondly, Italy, although it wasn't the largest colonizer in Africa, still had colonies. And in particular, in the Horn of Africa, they had colonies in Eritrea and an area called Italian Somaliland. So by conquering Ethiopia in 1935, at least they set out to do that, they were hoping to consolidate control over the Horn of Africa. Now, in opening up that war front in October 1935, they basically were given a green light by the two of the major European powers, England and France. Why did they basically give a green light to Italy? Well, it was because they were hoping that they could prevent Mussolini from becoming an ally of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi movement in Germany. Of course, that's going to change later in the 1930s. But in 1935, they were hoping to prevent that. So they basically issued an embargo, an arms embargo against Italy, which really wasn't effective. What about the United States government? Well, the United States government took a position of neutrality. They didn't want to get involved in a war in the Horn of Africa at that particular moment. And so they put out policies that basically said uh, Americans could not volunteer to fight in Ethiopia. And as we'll see later, there were a number of African Americans who did want to go and join the war effort. Now, the war lasted until May 1936. And initially, the Ethiopian army was quite uh, ferocious in terms of their response. Keep in mind that the Italians sent in a total of 100,000 troops. They had air superiority. They were quite willing to use poison gas, mustard gas, which was called the yellow rain, to uh, uh, prosecute its war. But by May of 1935, the war had concluded. Now, the war itself provoked outrage, especially in the global Black community. So it was not only among African Americans, but people of African descent and people in Africa, in many parts of the continent, West Africa in particular. And one of the questions we want to ask is, why did people respond so vehemently to the Italian invasion in 1935? Because one of the things that is very striking is that uh, there were very few Ethiopians who had direct connections with the uh, with the United States. There were a handful of Ethiopians who had come here as uh, students, and one in particular we'll talk about was very important in educating people. But we didn't have the same connections that African Americans had, for instance, with West and Central Africa because of the slave trade. So there were two things that, and perhaps three things that help explain why people were roused in such a way, in an emotional way, when Italy invaded Ethiopia. The first is that Ethiopia was well known because of its historic, as a historic home to Christianity. And of course, we know the stories from the Old and New Testament in which Ethiopia and Ethiopians are mentioned. Psalm 68, there's a famous passage, Ethiopia shall stretch out her hands unto God. And of course, the story of the Queen of Sheba, who went to Solomon's court, which is also well known. And so there's this image of Ethiopia in Africa as being one of the birthplaces of Christianity, and that was very important. So the famous preacher, Powell in New York City, had a church that was called the Abyssinian Baptist Church, inspired by Ethiopia. Secondly, Ethiopia was a symbol of Black sovereignty. During the period of European colonial conquest, Ethiopia had not been conquered. And so Ethiopia and Liberia, and of course Liberia was had its own issues with white rule, but Ethiopia, because of its defeat of Italy in 1896, became a symbol, a kind of icon for many Black people around the world, but in the United States, of Black independence, Black autonomy. And so when Italy invaded Ethiopia, that was a major challenge to people. Finally, we can talk about the importance of the Emperor Haile Selassie. Selassie has become king of Ethiopia in the late 1920s. And then in 1930, he was crowned the emperor of Ethiopia. And his crowning and his subsequent rule was something that was publicized widely, and especially in the Black press in the United States. His crowning as emperor also inspired a religious movement in Jamaica. Keep in mind that before he became Haile Selassie, his name was the Ross Prince Tafari. And so Rastafarianism became of course, a religious movement in Ethiopia, which regarded Haile Selassie as a divine, or the result of divine intervention. Now, before we get into the actual African-American response and protests to the run-up to the war and the war itself, just keep in mind what was happening in the United States in terms of African-American political activity in the mid-1930s. Remember that there were really a whole range of issues that people were dealing with. For instance, the campaign against lynching, economic survival, unemployment, segregated education. In other words, for many people, there was a focus more on what was happening on the home front rather than on global affairs. So, for instance, the NAACP was focused on tactics such as lobbying, legal interventions, public education. And so in the lead up to the war, they were not so much concerned about what was happening in Ethiopia. But once the war was initiated, they did become more actively involved. Now, let's turn to the issue of what was going on the ground, because even though some of the sort of elite Black organizations were not so engaged in Ethiopia until the war broke out, there were a lot of groups that were formed spontaneously before the war and during the war to raise people's awareness and consciousness and to help out in any way they could. So, for instance, at Howard University, there was an Ethiopian Research Council that was made up largely of Howard faculty like Ralph Bunch and a person we've already discussed, Hansberry. But there were other groups, they were quite numerous, that sprouted up all over the country. There was a group called the Friends of Africa. So what were they trying to do in terms of their support for Ethiopia? Well, first of all, they were trying to raise material support for Ethiopia, in particular, sending medical supplies. So there were groups that were quite active in gathering medical supplies to be sent to Ethiopia. There were propositions put forward to send arms and ammunition to Ethiopia, but those were blocked by the US government. Secondly, you did have some Ethiopians who were quite active in educating people about what was going on in Ethiopia. One person sticks out, and Vanessa, you could go to slide number 2, actually. The person up in the left-hand corner there, Malaku Bayan, had been a medical student at the Howard University Medical School, and he was quite influential in terms of reaching out to Black leaders to garner their support for what was going on in Ethiopia. Another thing that was motivating people was within the Black community, there was already a very strong opposition to fascism developing in Europe. And so anti-fascist protests fed into the protests. Another area in which people were engaged was quite literally thousands of people expressed their desire to volunteer to serve in Ethiopia in some capacity, whether joining the Ethiopian army or serving in other capacities. However, that was blocked by the United States government, which basically said, we are not going to issue any passports to anyone going to fight in Ethiopia. Another issue that is of interest is during this period, there were, one might ask the question, well, there were many Italian Americans, especially in the urban areas in the north. What were their relationships with African Americans? Well, it's interesting that a certain number of Italian Americans actually supported the defense of Ethiopia against Italy. These were people who were involved in anti-fascist organizations. There was a very strong presence, for instance, of the Communist Party in some of these activities. But you also had growing tensions between the Italian American community and African Americans. So in September, this is before the war broke out, but there was a riot in Jersey City, New Jersey, September 11th, between African Americans and Italian Americans. And it came after a heavyweight boxing match between Joe Louis and an Italian heavyweight boxer, Primo Carnera. Carnera was soundly defeated by Joe Louis. And of course, that sort of touched off a lot of emotions on both sides of the fight. Finally, there were numerous protests that took place during this period. And one of the striking things about this is that it involved people, working class folk, who got involved in the protests, especially in urban areas. Now, I might stress that people were roused not only in the urban areas, but in the rural areas as well. I was struck when I was reading up on this issue of a woman from my hometown in Oklahoma, very small town, but she wrote a very passionate letter expressing her opposition to the war in Ethiopia. Now, one of the largest set of protests took place in Harlem in New York City. There you had major street protests, but you had guys on street corners who were talking about the issue all the time. And maybe, Vanessa, could you go to slide number 11? If you can click all the way over there, just keep clicking. There we go. Is that on? Yeah, there we go. So you see in New York, this is one of the protests that was taking place, there was an event held at Madison Square Garden, which had an audience of nearly 20,000 people. What was interesting was that not only were there African Americans at this event, but there were also a number of white Americans as well. The final thing that I'd like to mention, and this is, I think, is really important in terms of our discussion about resources, is that the African American press became involved in educating people about the war and putting out op-eds, but also covering the war. So newspapers like the Amsterdam News, the Pittsburgh Courier, the Chicago Defender. There's a newspaper in Norfolk, Virginia, that was quite active in terms of spreading information about the war and really rousing people. In particular, I'd like to mention Claude Barnett. Claude Barnett was based in Chicago, and in 1919, he had established an organization called the Associated Negro Press. And this was an organization that put out press releases on issues affecting the Black community. In particular, on Ethiopia, they were quite vigorous in terms of sending out news bulletins to the African American press around the United States. Now, I've mentioned the fact that there were prohibitions against Americans, but in particular African Americans, in going to Ethiopia in the lead up to the war and during the war itself. However, there were two aviators, Black aviators, who did make it to Ethiopia. One of them was a fellow by the name of Hubert Julian, sorry. Go to slide 9, Vanessa. There we go. Go back, there we go. Julian was a kind of flamboyant pilot. He had gone to Ethiopia at the coronation of Haile Selassie in 1930, and he took the emperor's airplane out for a spin. He wasn't supposed to do that, and he crashed it. And that put him in bad odor with the emperor. But he came back in 1935 again, and once again, he was known as the Black Eagle. That was his moniker. He alienated the emperor and was basically ultimately told to leave the country. However, there was another aviator by the name of John Robinson. And this is a person that I think we all should be aware of. There's an excellent biography of him by Thomas Simmons. But he's somebody who goes to Ethiopia in May of 1935 and is going to stay throughout the war. Now, let me just talk a little bit about him. Go to slide 6, Vanessa. There we go. You can see that very distinguished, handsome guy in the center of the picture. He was born in 1903 in Florida, was raised in Mississippi. He went to Tuskegee for his undergraduate education. He became fascinated with airplanes, wanted to become a pilot himself, but it was not easy for an African Americans to qualify and get a pilot's license. But he went to Detroit. He was an excellent auto mechanic. He started his own mechanic firm. for cars. Then he went to Chicago and he started up his own shop. It took him a while to get permission to go to a flying school to qualify as a pilot. But eventually he does in 1929, and he and several other African-American aviators started their own airfield near Chicago. He also went back to Tuskegee to start an aviation department at Tuskegee. And of course, this became the nucleus of the Tuskegee Airmen in the Second World War. Now, in 1935, the Ethiopian medical doctor that I mentioned earlier, Bayan, goes to Claude Barnett in Chicago and he says, "Can you identify someone who can come over and help build up our plane fleet in Ethiopia?" And he nominates or delegates John Robinson. Robinson goes to Ethiopia, and the Emperor Selassie gives him the rank of colonel in the Ethiopian Air Force. Now, the Ethiopian Air Force was very small, maybe a dozen planes. There weren't any bombers. And of course, that put them at a great disadvantage when it came to the Italians. Now, how did he do this? Well, rather than say that he was going to Ethiopia to serve the Ethiopian emperor, he said he was going there on a business trip. And so people turned a blind eye when he showed up in Addis Ababa. During the war, when the war broke out, he became a very critical pilot in the Ethiopian Air Force. He was a courier to take messages back and forth between Addis Ababa and the war front. He also did reconnaissance, which was very dangerous work because he was out in a very wasn't a modern plane, and of course the Italian Air Force was looking for people like him to shoot down. And also he accompanied the Emperor Selassie to the front on various occasions. So he was in a very dangerous environment. Now, after the Italians moved and won the war and moved into Addis Ababa, he left. He got a plane, his own plane, and flew to Djibouti, and then returned to the United States. Now, very quickly, when he gets back, he's lionized in the Black community. A huge throng comes out to meet him in New York City. And then when he gets to Chicago, he is met by a mass audience of about 20,000 people in downtown Chicago. Just one quick thing about John Robinson. He maintains his ties to Ethiopia. He goes back to the country. The Italians had been expelled in 1941. He goes back there in 1943, and he stays there through the rest of his life. Sadly, he dies in a plane crash in 1954. But for those of you who are thinking about ways to present what was going on in Ethiopia, the life of John Robinson is a very interesting one. One final point. In the year after the Italians conquer Ethiopia in 1937-38, the Spanish Civil War opens up. And there, 100 African-American volunteers went to fight on the side of the Republicans in the war. There, the US government had a more difficult time because people were getting passports to go to Europe and made their way to Spain. So to sum up things, the Ethiopian War is very crucial in terms of understanding another chapter in terms of how African Americans became involved in international issues and especially in African issues. And of course, it lays a foundation for some of the efforts towards decolonization that begin to take shape in the 1940s. Let me stop there because I know we're dealing with time issues.
Yes, thank you. Shall I start the Q&A? Okay, great. We'd just like to offer you an opportunity to ask questions, generally a reaction to what you've heard, how you might use it to inform your work, and feel free to just raise your hand or put your question in the chat area. Of course, I have a question until we get started, but I just wanted to give you an opportunity first to share your reactions.
I believe there is a question.
I think Dr. Maura McLean had a question.
Okay. Righty. I'll go ahead and read that. Thank you, Brenda. Professor Edgar, can you say more about William Steen, also a former student of Hansberry and AAI co-founder? Thank you.
I'm going to say, I'm going to equivocate on that because Steen was one of the people who did become actively involved on the Ethiopian issue. And unfortunately, and in terms of preparation for this presentation, I saw the name William Steen discussed in two of the books that deal with this issue. In particular, a book by Joseph Harris, who was a Howard University history professor for many years. And more details are also found in an excellent book on African Americans in the Ethiopian War by William Scott, which came out in the 1990s. So those are two really foundation books for reading in much more detail. So you'll find discussions of Steen in both those books.
Great. Are those books included in the resource reference list?
I'm pretty sure they are. Yeah.
Any other questions? Maybe our audience might be interested in the Tuskegee Airmen connection here. You'd like to expound on that a little bit?
Is that directed to me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Well, during the war, of course, there was a lot of opposition in the U.S. Army to African Americans getting involved in the fighting, but in particular, joining the Air Corps. And of course, we know that that's still an issue in the U.S. Air Force. But a group of African American aviators based in Tuskegee at its Tuskegee Airfield became a sort of linchpin for getting African Americans involved in especially the war effort in the air. So one of the things that is really sort of carried over in all the decades ever since is that we we know every time a Tuskegee Airman dies, there's a lot of publicity given to these figures. There maybe are still a handful of them alive, but they become a very important presence in the U.S. over the decades, and so there have been films done on the Tuskegee Airmen, as well as books and numerous coverage of the issue. One of the things that's mentioned in your resources is a poem by the American poet, and I'm having a senior moment right now, but there was also, there's been a lot of coverage of African Americans and the World War II effort, and there's a fairly recent book which goes into great detail about African Americans during the Second World War, and so that's another issue that can be developed. Finally, in England during the mid-1930s, there were a group of people who were promoting Pan Africanism, and they become directly involved in the protests against the Italian invasion. And here we know a number of very prominent names, from George Padmore, who had been a student at Howard in the 1920s, Ross McConan, who came from Guyana, Jomo Kenyatta, Kwame Nkrumah, CLR James. All of them became involved in opposing the war effort, and of course, they became the nucleus of a group that were involved in the fifth Pan African Congress, which took place in Manchester, England, in 1944, as the war was a year away from ending.
Thank you for that.
How's our time, Shane?
I think we have 7 minutes till the very end, including your, if I'm not mistaken.
So maybe one more question, Helen, and then I'll share the resources.
Okay, great. I think we have a question from Shane. I'm curious how many people in attendance could incorporate the story of John Robinson, an African-American anti-fascism activism, into their teaching about the 1930s, World War II, and later anti-imperial movements. Maybe people could reply in the chat. So.
I just was
Sorry, is that
wondering
another question for me?
No, I was wondering,
Okay,
after hearing what you had to say about what other people who are who are participants, like where they teach, and if they would be able to teach about this, because it seems like such a natural fit to me. And so I was curious what other people thought.
Well, can I just give my thought on it? I'm a retired teacher, and I taught all subjects in practically all grades. If it's not in your curriculum for Western history, then it's going to be a problem, because they give you each quarter or each semester what you're supposed to teach. And if you're diverting from that, they usually can tell, because some of these things might be in the test that they give. So it's sort of, it will be hard, but you can always give it as a, just like when they go on Christmas break, they can do their own research. Kids can do their own research.
And I will have something to say about ways to incorporate it, as I did when I was working in a middle school.
The poet the poet's name that I drew a blank on is Langston Hughes. I don't know how I did that, but he was one of the few artists who wrote poetry about the war.
Thank you.
You.
I'm
So
sorry,
I
I'm
think
interjecting.
now maybe Vanessa is going to share the PowerPoint that has the resources, so we can do the reflection section. I'm Brenda Randolph and for the Center for African Studies at Howard University. And the next slide. So again, using the 5 W's and the 1H is a good way to begin research with students. Asking the questions, when did Ethiopia invade Ethiopia? Easy question for students to start with, easy for them to answer if they look that up. Where was information about the invasion shared? Who supported Ethiopia when the Italian army invaded? How did African Americans feel about the invasion, which Dr. Edgar has certainly spoken about? And what did they do to provide support, as he's also discussed? And why did African Americans think that this support was important? Next slide. So I'm highlighting these different resources that you can use with your students to talk about this issue. And as I mentioned, I worked in a middle school in Montgomery County in Maryland. And one of the places that I found to introduce the information about what happened in Ethiopia was it was called the 1940s, but most of it was about World War II, because what happens there is the precursor to many things in World War II, which Haile Selassie is trying to warn the world about. So that is a good place to introduce this information. And as Dr. Edgar just mentioned with Langston Hughes, and you'll see we have a slide of a little bit of the poem. You could introduce it through poetry. YouTube is very useful, and YouTube provides a video of Haile Selassie's speech at the League of Nations in 1936, which he delivered in Amharic. So you can actually click on that and hear him speaking. The Library of Congress provides a full text of the speech in Amharic and French. So in this instance, you could have students, as we do here in this area, many of the students in our area speak and can read Amharic. I can see a situation in which they could do kind of a role play with students speaking in Amharic and then someone putting the translation, some kind of like simultaneous translation in English, because we do have I found that there was the Rochester City School website had a translation of this speech in English, although the one on the Library of Congress has it in French. The World Catalog, which is a wonderful resource that all educators should know about. It makes it easy for you to browse the world's library from one easy search box. And it also, being a librarian, I know how important citation is and how students don't want to do it. So the WorldCat actually gives you the format to cite the resource that you're using in the very different, formats. Also, WorldCat links you to internet archives. And as you see on the slide, there's African American reactions to the war in Ethiopia, 1936 and 1941, which Dr. Edgar mentioned, by Howard's Joseph Harris. This book costs $103 for you to get a used copy of it. It is out of print, but you can read it through WorldCat and Internet Archives. And I took a screenshot of a photo, which is too small to actually see, but Leo Hansberry is in this shot. And you can, it allows you to read the resource for 30 minutes, and then you can re-up so that you can use the resource. So this is a wonderful resource to use with your students for things that are not accessible easily. Next slide. These websites provide information on African Americans and Caribbean Americans who were prominent in supporting Ethiopia. Dr. Edgar mentioned most of those. The Ethiopian World Federation, Bamako Biden, and of course, John Robinson, who was known as the Brown Condor. More about him a little bit later, but I have a resource at Howard we do called Discover Africa in the World. and it provides little information on people who were involved in Africa in the diaspora. And it's just the right amount of information for, let's say, a reluctant reader to kind of get into information about John Robinson. Next, we have the Poetry Nook, which talks about that poem Dr. Edgar mentioned, Call of Ethiopia. Yale University Library has information about Josiah Ford, who was the father of a person very close to Howard, Abi Ford, and his wife, Minyan, who went to Ethiopia as missionaries, and the work that they did there. Important African and Caribbean Americans for students to know about. Next slide. So here, I have a website called Africa Access Review, which has a database of K through 12 books for young people. And if you look in Africa Access Review, these books are listed there, but the one I really want to point out, in addition to The Man Called the Brown Condor about John Robinson again, is Black Dove, White Raven, which was the winner of one of our Children's Africana Book Awards. It is written for age 12 and up. It's an award-winning historical fiction which focuses on flying and includes John Robinson as a character, and it's focusing on the invasion and the war. We talked about a little bit about the history before this, when Ethiopia actually won the first the war against when the Italians invaded Ethiopia. The UNESCO Women in African History provides a lot of information about women in African history. As it says, and this one is about Tayutu Butel, who was the wife, she was the wife of Menelik, and she was important in helping to defeat the Italians. It's a student-friendly comic book that you can download from the site. You can reproduce it and use it in any way. It's just a wonderful resource to go a little bit back in history to talk about the first invasion and how Africans in Ethiopia how Ethiopians won the war. Next slide. Dr. Edgar mentioned the Black press. It is so essential to be able to look at the articles in the Black press. One of the best ways to do this is ProQuest, which is unfortunately often behind a paywall. So I'm not sure how much access you have, and we're trying to find out ways that we can support you when you're looking for these articles. Their Ancestry does have Ancestry Classroom, which provides free access to teachers for some of these newspapers, as does, you'll see at the bottom, Chronicling America, which has, you can filter for 382 newspapers on the about African Americans on the Library of Congress site. It is a little bit more challenging, I think, to use, but we are also working on ways to cite articles that are particularly germane to this topic. Next slide. Those are all the resources that we have that I cited in this presentation, but there's more. And you will be able to click on this resource folder and go to the resources that we have put together. And we are continuing to add resources, and I invite you to get in touch with me. We would love to help with any project that you're doing.